This programme was made with the support of the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland.
St. Patrick, he's the patron saint of Ireland.
Patrick, he was a Briton, brought up somewhere on the west coast of Britain during the latter years of the Roman Empire.
He got captured and taken away for slavery out to Ireland.
He then did escape. He got back home again. He had dreams at night of the Irish people calling to him and asking him to come back, and so he did.
Patrick realised that here he had to make a difference.
To have the courage to come back to that place which was cruel to him.
He did come back to Ireland and he preached all around the place.
An itinerant preacher, humility, traipsing through villages and places.
He was a man of courage, a man of strength, a man of character.
He was successful.
There's something of the hero in a person like that.
Patrick is famous as long as humankind survives.
I'm Paul Wright and welcome to the second programme of Back from the Brink, the series which investigates the role of the early medieval Irish in helping to save Western civilization. In our last programme we heard historians explain how St. Patrick's 5th century mission among the Irish helped to kickstart the golden age of Irish history, when Ireland became renowned as the land of saints and scholars. We also investigated Patrick's own life story, hearing how he was kidnapped at 16 years of age and brought from his home in Britain to work as a shepherd slave in Ireland for 6 years, before eventually escaping back to Britain. Now we got to the point in Patrick's story where he decided to return to Ireland in and around the year 432 AD in order to try convert the pagan Irish to Christianity. So just how brave was Patrick's decision to return to Ireland? Downpatrick-based historian Sean Grogan.
But yet the bravery of the man, this is where we have to look at that. Having experienced the Druids, that form of life which was totally alien to him, their rituals, their way of life, their worshipping false gods and all the rest, and then coming to have the courage to come back to that place which was cruel to him, and knowing what he was going into. That was a man of courage, a man of strength, a man of character. There's something of the hero in a person like that. But he said himself that he was no hero, and there was nothing of himself that was responsible. He said everything came from God who used him. And he spoke of himself as this a person who was a sinner, who was weak, and so on.
Patrick must have been a very charismatic personality. We know that when he arrived in 432, he came over by boat to the east coast of Ireland.
Michael King, historian and also curator of the Down County Museum in Downpatrick.
And really went up the coast into the Narrows and Strangford Lough, and then went along the coast to the Slaney River, where he hid his boat with his compatriots, and really was going to go inland, but he was spotted by a swineherd, and this man was obviously guarding the territory. And there's a rath very close to the Slaney River, actually, where he might have been based. But he told his chieftain in Saul, Dichu, that some strangers had arrived, and perhaps they were robbers, and they really thought that they were going to rob them of their pigs and cattle, possibly. And Dichu really set off with the intention of killing Patrick and his friends, and met up with them and challenged them. And Patrick was very quickly able to really turn Dichu around and explain what his mission was, and very soon seems to have converted Dichu. And that was the most important thing that he could have done, because he needed the chieftains and the rulers really to really support him, and so that their own people then could be converted and churches built, and really Christianity could then thrive.
He became great friends with Deku, who gave him this sawil, this cow shed. And it is said that Patrick first celebrated Mass here in the cow shed. I like to feel that there's a parallel, if I may say so, between the cow shed here and a cow shed in a place called Bethlehem.
Historian Sean Grogan. Here's County Down local historian Albert Colmar to take up the story.
Ireland was a rural society, not developed like cities in Britain and Europe of that time. It was very much a rural, dispersed, localised community. People lived separate lives. They were continually warfaring each other, trying to get additional land, taking advantage of each other. That was the way up the social scale. So Patrick realised that here he had to make a difference.
It was a country of chieftains and petty chieftains and farmers of different grades, and we know this from the laws.
Historian Michael King once again.
And it was a warlike society because we know about battles that we read about in the various annals, and we know that the people who lived here in County Down were the Dalfeator, who were part of the Uli clan, you might say. Who had originally lived over to the west and had really been based at Navan until they were driven over in this direction by the Aeneal. And there was a very long history of warfare between these peoples. And in fact, in Patrick's lifetime, there was that continued.
He seemed to have this, again, it was part of his intelligence and his native kind of, you could call it cunning or shrewdness, that he knew these people, he knew their style, he knew how to reach them.
Joseph Duffy, historian and also author of the best-selling book on St. Patrick called Patrick in His Own Words.
And the main thing that he did very successfully was that he seemed to be able to seek out the people of influence in any given society, in any given community, and make a beeline for them and get them on his side. Now, where he succeeded in doing that, he knew he was in business, because if the chief accepted him and heard him out and agreed with him, then he was assured of a good hearing among the ordinary people. And we take it that this, and he says himself very often that this is what stood to him. Now, we also know, of course, that he did encounter a lot of danger, physical danger.
The same pattern seems to happen over and over again. Yes, he talks about himself being put in danger. He talks about himself being put into jail, and imprisoned many times, not just once, but many times.
Tim Campbell, director of the St. Patrick Centre, situated in Downpatrick, County Down.
The pattern is that he would show up somewhere, he would found a church, people didn't like the look of him, they would put him into prison. The previous people who he had made Christian would bail him out. He would complete the church, he would make converts, and then he would go to the next place where they didn't like the look of him, so they would put him in jail, and the previous guys would bail him out. Now, what happened was, there's a lot of different kingdoms, and he went from one to the next, and royal patronage would have been important in those days. He also seems to have, according to the legends rather than his own words, lit the Paschal fire in Ireland as well on the hill of Slane, which really annoyed the High King at Tara. So he's obviously putting his neck on the line a whole lot of times as he's going around, both in his records and in the legends that were written about him.
And many of his colleagues, many of those similarly disposed to preaching the word, were actually killed. That again you can find in his writings. He alludes to this time and time again. Patrick must have been a wonderful character. He must have been totally committed. I wouldn't like to think he'd gone over the top, but he must have been way out on his own, and he must have been number one on the hit list to be taken out, as we say today, by those who were objecting to him reforming, restructuring society as Ireland knew it at that time.
Historian Albert Colmar. Here's historian Sean Grogan to continue the story.
He wouldn't have been wearing a mitre and carrying a crozier. No, he would have been probably in a dress like some kind of monk or that of that Roman period, because he was absolutely. Now he was a bishop coming back, because he would have been coming back again in the Roman clothes from Britain. Now, what would he have experienced here? Because he would have been standing out like a sore thumb, going to a particular settlement.
An itinerant preacher, humility, traipsing through villages and places, especially in the beginning of his journey here. After that, maybe more passionate, more vocal, but in the beginning I would say very passionate, just like an itinerant preacher traipsing from village to village. That's what you would see.
Patrick, I'm sure there's many a day food hardly crossed his mouth. If you could get water, when Ireland is famous for its rainfall, its springs, the holy wells which came under the guise of the Christian Church, which was believed and used by those of the old faiths, the gods who lived in the waters. There's always water in Ireland. I'm quite sure many a day he had nothing but water. But he got by. And we didn't have the cities. Ireland wasn't a city, as we talked about before. It wasn't a city island. But there were certain areas of population. And as he moved up into places like Downpatrick today, it has always been a settlement site from at least about 4000 BC. So there were areas that we like to call them cities in the old language. Today they'd be small towns or villages. Most people lived in scattered communities, either in rafts on top of hilltop sites. So this man coming, preaching, they'd want to see him. They want to hear what he's talking about, and no doubt they shared his food.
You could see Patrick coming along and them being very suspicious of what he was about. What was he coming to do? Was he coming to enslave them? How dare you tell us about another god? We know the gods in which we... And it would have taken, he must have been frustrated many, many times. But eventually, by his patience, by his prayerfulness, but by his own goodness, there must have been something radiating from him that influenced others. And I think that came from a spirituality, a lived Christianity that became infective, you could say. Because it seemed to be remarkable that in such a short time, those who had practiced a way of life and a religion for thousands of years abandoned that.
Historian Sean Grogan. Over to Celtic Church historian Andy Rain of Holy Island, Lindisfarne.
Some of the Druids that Patrick encountered became the earliest leaders in the church in Ireland. They'd been the spiritual leaders of the people, and their own prophecies actually had been pointing towards what was coming. So they actually saw the coming of Christianity as the fulfillment of everything that religion had already pointed to.
We could say that Patrick himself was respectful of the customs, the traditions of the pagans with whom he had lived for so many years. And when he came back again, it was his knowledge of, his appreciation of, at least these people had a sense of God and knew that there were something or someone beyond themselves. After all, why would they worship a sun? Why would they worship the stars? Why did they... What it was saying was this: he respected that they said, there's something or someone beyond us. We are not our own makers. We have nothing of ourselves, but we have power from above. And he would have used that respectfully then to bring about his own message.
Any man who preaches God, whether it be Catholic, Protestant, or any Christian, any faith, when they go up and they preach and they speak and you listen to them, you hear them, but it doesn't really mean a big lot. Now, if you meet a man who has experienced some spiritual intervention or a meeting with God, when they preach, their words have weight. Very, very weighty words. And then when they preach, they're willing to say, right, I'm going to drop everything, I'm going to this village, or I'm going there. It's passionate. People say, oh, he's crazy, man, he's shouting there. Yes, he's passionate, he's crazy, but he believes he's had an experience with God, so he will go out and he will speak what he really, really believes, deeply believes in. So, in connection with Patrick, when he comes back to Ireland, he's not coming back because he wants to come back or he feels like it. He actually believes God sent him here. God Almighty has sent him here, so he's passionate. He's not really afraid. I'm sure he gets nervous and apprehensive, but he really believes in what he's doing. He's willing to give his life to a cause, drop everything and just go, not worry or anxious about anything, passionate and really believing in what he's doing.
Selfless love was Patrick's song to all the Irish race. A quiet revolution came, transforming every place. And the nation's heart was one of love, with prayer a holy sage, to make an island fit for saints, to read the holy page. Feel the wind of changes come, embrace what's good for you, and always do to others as they would do to you. Yes, feel the wind of changes come, with Patrick's message true, and always do to others as you'd have them do to you, and always do to others as you'd have them do to you.
There's a lovely story. He went down to Cashel and he was baptised in Angus.
Bangor-based Celtic Church historian Marsden Fitzsimons.
And Angus, at the end, Patrick noticed that Angus' foot was bleeding. And he said, what has happened? Angus told Patrick, you put the staff, you put it down into the ground, you thought it was, but it was my foot. And he said, Patrick said, why didn't you tell me? But he said, I thought that was part of the ceremony. So the legend of Patrick, but Patrick was a tremendous person, walking all over Ireland.
Again, I love to compare actually and parallel Patrick with Paul, because do you remember Paul when he was in Athens?
Historian Sean Grogan.
He went round the town and he noticed all the different pagan things that were there. And he said, I see an altar there which you have belonging to the unknown God. Let me tell you about that unknown God. So he actually used that there. And Patrick would have used the pagan things. Let me tell you, he said, you are speaking of the flame at Tara to celebrate the celebration of the god Yostre. Okay, and she to celebrate her, and she's the flame of life. Let me tell you now why I'm lighting this flame. This is the flame of the Jesus who died, rose again, and the flame is a symbol of his resurrection. You know, so he would have used even those symbols of paganism, as Paul did, to get his message across. Clever, but also acutely sensitive, someone who had an eye and would use every person, place or thing in order to get his message across. A true missionary.
And during his many years of missionary work in Ireland, one of Patrick's biggest problems was outside interference. As the Roman Empire collapsed in Patrick's own native Britain, petty kings along the west coast of Britain rushed in to fill the power vacuum by carving out new kingdoms for themselves and by taking up piracy. Unfortunately for Patrick, the forces of one such piratical king called Caradocus descended on the coast of Ireland, butchered many of Patrick's new Irish converts, as well as kidnapping many others to sell into slavery. Lindisfarne-based early medieval historian Kate Tristram.
One of the things that was very much living at this time all over this part of the Western world was the slave trade. Patrick himself had experienced it when he was taken as a slave, and he experienced it again when Britons, who should have been Christians, who were Christians, felt that they could do slave raiding in Ireland. And it came particularly home to Patrick when some of the people that he had converted to the Christian faith were actually captured and taken away as slaves. He says they'd only just been baptized, he says. They were very, very new Christians. How can you possibly, yourself being a Christian, do that kind of thing to fellow Christians?
The letter to Coroticus, the Welsh chieftain, who captured his army, came along, took away a number of his converts. They'd just been baptized in the Christian faith. They're still probably wearing their regalia of white uniform. The men were probably killed, or the fit ones would have been, if they survived, would have been taken away as slaves again. The young virgins, which they tended to be, were raped, killed, or again taken away, and would just become prostitutes. It was a horrendous, and to see a man's justified anger. Today, if we came out with an outburst that Patrick came out, probably find yourself in jail somewhere. But Patrick believed the wrath of God was upon the likes of Coroticus. He probably was the one that's remembered, but there are many, many cases of where, and we have to accept, slavery was the accepted custom of that time.
Albert Colmar. Here's historian Sean Grogan to share his views.
These soldiers of Coroticus, and he railed against them and said, if they don't stop this, they're supposed to be Christian, and yet what are they doing with these converts to Christianity? They're making them slaves. How dare they do that? And he said, if you don't stop this practice, you will be excommunicated. What does excommunicate mean? You are no longer part of the community. Out of communion with the Christianity that you should be practicing.
Let every God-fearing man know that they, Coroticus and his soldiers, are enemies of me and of Christ my God, for whom I am an ambassador. Patricide, patricide, ravening wolves that eat the people of the Lord as they eat bread. As is said, the wicked, O Lord, have destroyed your law, which but recently had been excellently and kindly planted in Ireland by the grace of God. I, Patrick, ask earnestly that this letter be read before all people, including the presence of Coroticus himself, that God may inspire him and his kind to recover their senses, repent, however late, for heinous crimes committed.
It was really another version of the way Patrick himself was kidnapped, except that this happened in Ireland, didn't happen in Britain, on mainland Britain.
Historian and patrician scholar Joseph Duffy.
But it was that kind of thing that these people landed, and they saw these young people. Presumably they were young people. They were certainly new Christians anyway, recently confirmed. And Patrick says that the oil of chrism was flowing out of them, and they were in their Sunday best and so on, and that they were actually kidnapped. I mean, that's what the letter was complaining about, and kidnapping then, as Patrick knew, was very, very serious and very dangerous, because some of them at least would have been killed in the whole affray, and some of them would have died from the consequences of violence and so on. So Patrick anyway had to deal with that as best he could, and he summoned all the resources he had, his own boiling anger and fury.
The riches Coroticus had gathered up unjustly shall be vomited from his belly. The angel of death drag him away. By the fury of dragons he shall be tormented. The viper's tongue kill him, as well as an unquenchable fire devour him. Woe to those like Coroticus who fill themselves with what is not their own. For what doth it profit a man that he gain the whole world and yet suffer the loss of his own soul?
And historian Sean Grogan also had this pertinent comment to make.
If we take this thing about Patrick and his attitude towards Coroticus and what his soldiers were doing and making slaves of these converts to Christianity, there's no one can speak better of cancer than one who has it. No one can speak of an illness, of deafness, unless that person experienced deafness. No one can speak of slavery unless one has been a slave himself. And so Patrick, who was the slave, could know precisely what it was to be abused, misused, cruelly treated.
He sent an envoy over to Coroticus. He did appeal to the church leaders of the time in and around to Coroticus to isolate the man.
Historian Albert Colmar.
There is no evidence at all that Coroticus, in fact there's evidence that he probably scoffed at the efforts being made. So whilst Patrick appealed and appealed and appealed for the return, the safe return, even they had been abused, of these women and the young male slaves, there is no evidence that it ever happened. So one can assume that it was not easy for people like Patrick, and he wasn't on his own. We're talking about other Christian missionaries at that time, and Patrick was campaigning, bringing the faith, this new faith, to people in the island of Ireland. There is evidence that there could well have been many, many other people physically objecting to this new form, this new faith that made men, women and children equal in the sight of God.
And to find out how Patrick overcame many other challenges during his 30 years of missionary work among the Irish, including how he fought off vicious interference from British bishops, then make sure to catch our next number 3 programme in this 12-part Back from the Brink series. This programme was made with the support of the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland, songs by Cliff Wedgbury. Until our next programme, from myself, Paul Wright, bye for now.
Born in Rome and Britain, kind Patrick was his name. As Caesar's empire fell apart, the Irish pirates came.